I would like to thank you for joining us today, and I would like to introduce my colleagues. We will have a presentation for 15 minutes each one of us, and then we will have the question at the end of the panel. I would like to thank my colleagues, Omneya and Dr. Sheheryar and Amany for joining us. And we will start, because we are late actually, so we will start by Omneya presentation. Please.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Omneya Makhlouf. I was an international and comparative law student here at AUC last year. I graduated from my master's, and this was my research. This was my thesis that I presented last year. So I'm very grateful to be here today, and I'm very honored to be at this prestigious conference. So thank you all for being here. So today I'm going to speak to you about a global issue involving a high level of civilian deaths, men, women, and children, as a result of armed conflicts. Armed conflicts where we're not really sure who to blame. Attempting to understand the dynamics of these erupting wars has proven to be a difficult task. We ask questions like, what is the reason behind the conflict? Why have the UN and international law been unable to keep civilians from being attacked and killed? Why has the UN been unable to fulfill its mandate and provide humanitarian assistance to areas that need it the most? And we see examples of this in countries like Yemen and Sana'a, and Sirte in Libya, and Donetsk in Ukraine. Our world has been facing these issues firsthand, civilian suffering, and United Nations agencies unable to mitigate the impact of their suffering. This is largely because of the nature of conflicts nowadays. They've become unconventional and complex. Non-state armed groups have become increasingly involved in these conflicts. And when I say non-state armed groups, these are groups who take up arms that are not affiliated with the state. They've caused us as an international community to become unable to resolve these conflicts or to take the necessary actions to mitigate the impact as mentioned. So I attempt to provide answers to these questions from a legal perspective through analyzing a framework called international humanitarian law, which is also known as the laws of war. So the title of my paper is United Nations Access Challenges and Non-State Armed Groups in Conflict Situations, the Need for Legal Reform. During armed conflict, UN agencies have access issues, meaning they're unable to enter particular territories with affected populations, especially in areas that are controlled by non-state armed groups. As mentioned, Yemen, Libya, and Ukraine are stark examples of this case. And there are several reasons for these access challenges, one of which is the inadequate legal framework that governs non-state armed groups. Non-state armed groups have in fact become significant players in international relations. They've increased in their regional power and their ability to affect politics. But the current legal framework governing them is insufficient to enable the interaction between United Nations agencies and non-state armed groups. But this is not to neglect the operational and executive ineffectiveness of the United Nations as a whole. They are, in fact, part and parcel of the political dynamics that shape these conflicts. In fact, the United Nations' ineffectiveness on several accounts complements the inefficiencies we witness in the legal system, which eventually lead to a political and legal environment that UN agencies are unable to operate in at their fullest. The legal system marginalizes non-state armed groups, which effectively causes access challenges for UN agencies. In my research, I chose Yemen, Libya, and Ukraine to first illustrate the severity of access constraints faced by United Nations agencies in non-governmental controlled areas. The second, they are countries where UN agencies and NGOs are the primary humanitarian actors. And third, I've added Ukraine to my analysis to provide an account of a non-Arab country, showing that United Nations impediments are not restricted to the Middle East. At the time of writing, which was April-May of 2016, the war in Yemen was fiercely volatile. In 2011, Yemeni opposition groups formed to combat the regime, and militia groups were emerged. Now we witness a situation where there are government forces combating local non-state armed groups, along with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, the Saudi-led coalition forces, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Each faction controls an area of land within Yemen. What was the result? As you can see from the statistics, there are 21.2 million people who were in need of humanitarian assistance at the time. Now, a year later, of course, these numbers have increased. The effect on civilians was devastating, and a large portion of the affected populations were under the control of non-state armed groups. UN agencies had difficulty accessing them for security reasons, damaged infrastructure, and ultimately granting access by the controlling authority. And the UN is unable to recognize the non-state armed groups because they are not the legitimate authority and they do not adhere to international law principles. So what ends up happening? They're not granted access to the affected populations and they're unable to deliver their humanitarian assistance. But political dynamics and the United Nations' ineffectiveness also play a role. The involvement of the Saudi-led coalition has not actually deterred the threat of the rebel groups in Yemen. In fact, it has exacerbated the conflict, with non-state armed groups mobilizing to combat foreign intervention. In addition, the intervention was given an overwhelming support to Saudi Arabia by the US and the UK, financially and through weaponry, both of which were actually approved by the United Nations. This has ultimately led to the death and the injury of far more civilians than anticipated. So, this means that the political dynamics and the role of the United Nations are actually a part of the problem and have ultimately failed in ensuring a peaceful resolution is reached. In practice, states and the United Nations immediately resort to combating non-state armed groups militarily because under this current legal framework, there is no political solution with such groups, only a militarized one. This means that states are either attempting to use international law to combat non-state armed groups but are failing, or that international law itself has failed to provide a legitimate avenue for dealing with such groups. Either way, the laws as they are today are an inefficient mechanism of governing the interactions between non-state armed groups and humanitarian agencies. Such a situation is replicated in the Libyan crisis. There is a high level of violence posed by non-state armed groups and ineffectiveness of the United Nations because of political dynamics. There are two factions here, one government and one rebel, with third-party intervention by, of course, NATO. By 2014, several factions emerged in the region, eventually creating a conflict with Islamist groups, countless rebel groups, and two separate government structures, both of which are recognized by different countries. So what ended up happening was UN staff were forced to evacuate from Libya and shut down their operations. They now operate from Tunisia and other areas, which makes their ability to deliver humanitarian assistance all that much harder. And on several occasions, ports were seized by non-state armed groups, ultimately halting the United Nations operations. And as you can see again with the statistics, there are 2.4 million people who need protection and humanitarian assistance. But it's actually difficult to estimate the exact number of those affected because, of course, access constraints. There's also difficulty here in recognizing the legitimate authority, where militia groups may simply reject access to UN agencies because they recognize an authority that the militia group opposes. Once more, the lack of adherence to international law principles poses an obstacle also attributed to the political dynamics between states, where the UN is unable to separate itself from those dynamics. The recognition of a particular government over the other is solely based on political affiliations within the region that the UN must abide by, not on the legitimate sovereignty of one of these entities. Furthermore, the United Nations Security Council's authorization of NATO's intervention in Libya should have been based on the responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention or an act of self-defense, but on the contrary, it was purely based on political and economic motives for the US, and not with the motive of protecting the Libyan population. The Ukrainian crisis was slightly different because Russia actually facilitated the rebels' ability to separate. So in eastern Ukraine, there's a region called Donbass, which consists of two provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk. These provinces decided to ethnically separate from Ukraine, leading to a war between Kiev, the capital, and these separatist entities. The result was displacement all over Ukraine, and the sanctions on Russia due to the Crimea incident, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, had left Ukraine with very little aid. And approximately 3.7 million people were affected by the conflict in both government-controlled areas and non-government-controlled areas. So conclusively, all three crises face concerning humanitarian situations. United Nations agencies face access constraints to certain regions due to the presence of non-state armed groups who do not adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law. Through the analysis of these conflicts, it is evident that non-state armed groups do, in fact, play a prominent role in the dynamics of conflicts nowadays. But what does the literature say about this? Scholars differ on the significance of non-state armed groups in international relations. Some views are that the non-state armed groups are simply a byproduct of the international system because state sovereignty and territorial integrity are the pinnacle of international law principles. However, specifically after the eruption of the Arab Spring, non-state armed groups have effectively challenged this. Their ability to mobilize, take up arms, and gain access to technology and support is unprecedented. Their current power has ultimately affected state sovereignty. Each of the roles of non-state armed groups and states must be acknowledged and dealt with according to their particular structure and demands. This is not to say that the violent acts of non-state armed groups should be met with appeasement, but rather it must be acknowledged that their ability to affect international politics and compromise state sovereignty is becoming increasingly alarming. And because humanitarian organizations are only able to function through state consent, it is imperative that states be willing to integrate non-state armed groups within the system so as to achieve that end. Approaching the rise of non-state armed groups through the lens of reciprocity between them and humanitarian organizations will support the reassessment of the legal framework governing non-state armed groups. So looking at the legal framework governing them, I identified, as I said, international humanitarian law. This was through attempting to understand how international law actually defines non-state armed groups. Because non-state armed groups take up arms, they are effectively subject to the laws of war, or international humanitarian law. These laws are stipulated in treaties called the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols. These laws are also enshrined in what we call customary international law, which is based on the customs of state actions and what they say, also used in this analysis. I then narrowed those laws to those that mention each party to the conflict. Because these articles don't limit their application to the state, but also an entity involved in the conflict. The important ideas to note within the analysis are the following. Under international humanitarian law in these particular conflicts, where there is a high level of uncertainty, there are complexities of qualifying conflicts as international or non-international, meaning international or domestic. Because conflicts have now become transnational, with non-state armed groups performing cross-border operations, or their activities become so extensive that it involves more than one non-state armed groups within several territories and international personalities, it is difficult to identify whether this is a domestic conflict or an international one. But research has shown that even if we were to attempt to apply both doctrines of an international armed conflict and a non-international armed conflict simultaneously, several discrepancies and contradictions arise. This is largely because international armed conflicts are governed by a different set of laws than that of non-international armed conflicts, where the international armed conflicts are governed by the Geneva Conventions as a whole, and only certain provisions govern non-international armed conflicts. So non-international armed conflicts in themselves are difficult to apply because they have stringent conditions for application. But assuming we were able to qualify the conflict as international or non-international, the laws themselves pose great difficulty in application for several reasons. One of which is that there's actually no mechanism of holding non-state armed groups accountable to violations under international law. Furthermore, the foundation of international law is based on consent and reciprocity, which means that states give their consent to be bound by international law principles, and in return, they receive protections and guarantees, and are also penalized for violations. In contrast, international law obliges non-state armed groups to adhere to international law principles without their express consent, and does not provide them with the same guarantees and cannot punish them. So, for example, under an international armed conflict, there is an obligation for all parties to the conflict to protect civilians and grant prisoners of war their rights. This becomes problematic because there can be no obligation on a non-state armed group to discriminate between a civilian and a combatant when targeting the opposition, without giving the non-state armed group the same privilege. This also means that any article that should ideally bind non-state armed groups to allow an impartial humanitarian body, like the United Nations, to offer its services to the wounded and sick is impossible to apply. The laws also insist that non-state armed groups should remain as such, and their legal personality cannot be affected during the conflict, meaning that non-state armed groups will not be recognized as anything but non-state armed groups. So there's no incentive for them to adhere to international law principles. There are situations, however, where non-state armed groups could be elevated to the status of insurgent or belligerent under international humanitarian law. But this all depends on the state's recognition of them. In reality, of course, states are reluctant to recognize non-state armed groups as insurgents or belligerents because they would be granted combatant status. And this means that they would be provided with guarantees and protections, which of course the state doesn't want. So any kind of legal reciprocity of protection to non-state armed groups is ultimately left for the state to decide, hence the state centricity of the system. A lack of reciprocity is also exhibited under non-international armed conflicts, where the laws stipulate that foreign intervention by a third party may occur only on behalf of the state. But because non-state armed groups will remain as non-state armed groups, it is illegal for any state to intervene in the conflict on their behalf. Yet, a state may intervene in the conflict on behalf of the state. Not only is a lack of reciprocity exhibited here, but international humanitarian law also assumes that the differentiation between state and rebel groups will be clearly identified. And in a conflict like Libya, where it's unclear where the legitimate authority lies, this becomes very difficult, and a further gap is created. Regarding UN agencies, articles under the framework of international humanitarian law that should allow humanitarian agencies access to affected populations in non-government controlled areas, it's inapplicable as well, because non-state armed groups continuously violate it. Furthermore, specific articles that should grant humanitarian access to a territory only limit access granting to the authority of the state. So essentially it's disregarding the areas that are controlled by non-state armed groups, so non-governmental controlled areas. And because humanitarian agencies should not be requesting access from non-state armed groups because they will effectively be recognizing their authority, they are faced with a deadlock. Hence the crisis that we're in today, as you all might know what's happening in Syria, of course. This is a clearly identifiable gap in the system. whereby the law does not explicitly bind non-state armed groups to grant access to United Nations agencies, but United Nations agencies are simultaneously bound by the principles of maintaining state sovereignty. Finally, if we were to assume that the principles of international humanitarian law as a whole, whether the conflict is international or non-international, are considered principles of customary international law, which essentially should bind everyone, whether you're a non-state actor, whether you're a non-member of the United Nations, we still face the same issues. There is no reciprocity in the system, and non-state armed groups would not adhere to the principles of customary international law because they weren't actually involved in their creation, due to the state centricity of the creation of customary law. In addition, non-state armed groups are considerably unaware of the principles of international law because they haven't been integrated into the system of knowledge. So it's unrealistic, to say the least, to expect them to adhere to international law principles. So we can see through these examples that there's basically no reciprocity in the system. This rigidity within the state-centric system is identified as the problematic factor in my analysis. This system should be reformed to incorporate the rights of non-state armed groups in order to facilitate fairness in the application of the laws that would benefit UN agencies' access requests. So as mentioned in my introduction, the role of the United Nations complements these arguments. It's essential to recognize that the executive part of the UN causes access challenges for its own agencies. The high-level decisions of the UN have ultimately led to the stagnancy of the laws that we've just discussed, largely attributed to the Security Council, who on several occasions have authorized foreign intervention, leading to the intensification of conflicts. Furthermore, there are inherent operational challenges within UN agencies that hinder their ability to fulfill their own mandates. However, we cannot neglect the benefits that UN agencies provide to affected populations in an attempt to alleviate the impact of conflicts on civilians. In that light, there should be legal reforms that take place. Both legal reforms and policy and operational reforms must run in parallel. Legal reform would offer a plausible solution to the lack of adherence to customary law by non-state actors. This necessitates that non-state armed groups are granted a mechanism to become decision makers within the legal system, and in return will be held accountable for violating the principles they have agreed to, inclusive of customary principles. It would also provide a platform for UN agencies to be given more opportunities to create dialogue with non-state armed groups, and will be granted further access to non-government controlled areas. Furthermore, creating an environment with a higher level of accountability for UN agencies along the reformation of the current legal and political structures that govern non-state armed groups would ultimately alleviate the access challenges that agencies face. We must bear in mind, however, that the proposition of reform is not only based on amending the laws and creating new customs, which requires an elongated process of state practice and cooperation, but rather it is also based on attempting to revolutionize the approach that states, scholars, lawyers take when addressing non-state armed groups in an armed conflict, which is not easy, to say the least. As for policy reforms within the UN, UN institutions should be held accountable for their errors and ineffectiveness. Preaching a culture of fairness and justice whilst providing immunity to humanitarian personnel and their respective institutions in an effort to lessen reputational risks is hypocritical, to say the least. This particular policy suggestion is difficult to implement, but not impossible if other institutions were to demand justice from the United Nations, using the limits of the law as their gateway. UN organizations should also consider disempowering donor demands, creating a framework where donors would be subjected to the mandate of the organization as opposed to state policies, would effectively expand the outreach of UN organizations to affected populations. Finally, in an effort to bind non-state armed groups to international principles, some humanitarian agencies have taken an initiative to develop an agreement with non-state armed groups in order to tackle the issue of access constraints, among other challenges. They've created what we call rules of engagement. And these are essentially a form of code of conduct created to invite non-state armed groups to adhere to international law principles in exchange for providing them with an international personality. These rules are essentially enshrined in international humanitarian law and customary international law, and are made to ensure that the least amount of damage is caused on civilians during conflict, ensuring the protection of humanitarian agencies, aid and their convoys, and attempting to facilitate and monitor national dialogues and international dialogues between non-state armed groups, states, and humanitarian agencies. Through these dialogues, non-state armed groups are able to voice their concerns to the international community, and their cooperation is reciprocated. But of course, the issue here is state willingness to be involved in such dialogues, which is not always guaranteed. But these rules and reforms, although they do not completely resolve issues of access constraints for UN agencies, but they serve as a starting point to mitigate the impact of that affected populations face due to these access constraints. And integrating such rules within international law could potentially do that. Furthermore, applying such a structure would create a process of accountability, where non-state armed groups would be bound by principles of international humanitarian law in exchange for being recognized as non-state armed groups with a legal personality that does not necessarily equate to a state, but they have similar rights in warfare at least. In conclusion, relying on the current laws of international humanitarian law causes a gap in the system. There are access constraints for United Nations agencies. Fluctuating political dynamics, of course, play a role in this, causing UN ineffectiveness based on state interests. And this dynamic as a whole maintains the legal and political positioning of non-state armed groups, which is exactly the point of the state centricity. It's done on purpose. It's done with the intention of keeping non-state armed groups on the sidelines. But if we develop the current legal framework, not necessarily change it, to incorporate non-state armed groups within the legal systems so we can facilitate a dialogue with them, and we'll be more able, as the United Nations, to enter the areas that have access constraints and we're not able to reach affected populations in. These are through policy and operational reforms and through the rules of engagement doctrine that I've just discussed. So, if this is applied, UN agencies would be granted access to non-governmental controlled areas, with the consent of both the states and non-state armed groups. A process of accountability would be in place to ensure that they adhere to international law principles, and finally, affected populations would be able to receive the aid that they deserve. If we decide as an international community to do this, we can begin to see a world with less casualties and less suffering. Thank you. Sorry, I went over time. My apologies. Are there any questions? Yes?
Do you think that advocating such reforms would put you on the fire line against people who will tell you that by doing so you are giving a legal personality to terrorist organizations?
That's exactly it, which is a risk. But what other options do we have, right? So you have terrorist organizations that states recognize as terrorist organizations, but their only method of dealing with them are through military actions. And that's obviously proven to be the worst way to deal with them, because it kills civilians and causes bloodshed and suffering, men, women, and children. So the idea here is, okay, we tried this way, it's not working, let's try another way, even if we are going to go outside of the current legal framework of state centricity that we're focused on. So that's the idea of states, right? They want to keep the terrorists where they are because they threaten their sovereignty. But we need some kind of reform process to change that approach, to say this. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
What would motivate the non-state armed groups to accept these rules of engagement? What's in it for them?
That's the whole idea, right? So non-state armed groups, they don't adhere to international principles because they get nothing out of it. And that's the idea. There's still people who want something, which is why they're fighting, which is why they're taking up arms. So ultimately, when you talk to non-state armed groups, which United Nations agencies have, they want something, whether it's recognition, whether it's independence, whether it's that they've been oppressed and they want to secede from the country that's been oppressing them. Once you give them a platform where they can actually talk about what it is that they want, this gives them a small but effective incentive to stay away from civilians. So what the United Nations and humanitarian organizations have been doing with these rules of engagement is that they're telling them, listen, you can get what you want, but stay away from the civilians. We will facilitate international and regional and national dialogues with you and states and humanitarian organizations, but please stay away from the civilians. So they are getting something out of it, which is at least being in the process of national and international dialogues. And that's the starting point, like I said. So I have run out of time, as Dina is graciously telling me to do. So I'm very sorry for going over time, but thank you so much for your attention. It was a pleasure.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to present institutions and redistribution. We're talking about political economy issues, and this is actually a lab experiment. The story about this paper is it was commissioned by the World Bank for the World Development Report 2017. That report, it's online. It focuses on governance and the law. And what we're concerned about with that report, and indeed with a lot of research that I've done for the World Bank, is about elite behavior. Okay? So this is stuff that you don't necessarily observe in the real world, is how people make decisions with regards to, in this particular case, your taxes. And so I'll show you kind of how we set this up. Now, of course, we know that there is a large literature that focuses on just policymaker behavior in general, but we tend to infer that behavior from vague actions. And what I mean by that is that it's not necessarily well identified. You see things in the policy space, and you have journalists that interpret different actions in different ways and say, oh, this is why this policy has been enacted, this is why that policy has been enacted. And so what makes it difficult for us as scientists is to decouple the mechanisms, right? The reasons why people are engaging in different things, and to be able to observe how people make actual decisions. Now, with lab experiments, we tend to go in that direction. Okay? We use a series of games, and I'm going to describe some of them to you. The Common Pool Resource game is one that was pioneered by Lynn Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for this. But then also the public goods game. And the idea is to see how people voluntarily contribute to governance, to taxes, essentially, right? How people make contributions to public goods, and then how those public goods get distributed. That's essentially what we've been concerned about. Now, the key problem here, of course, is that the insights that we have as economists, particularly from the lab, are from a very narrow set of goods. So these public goods are, how we describe public goods is essentially, military or security or things like that, right? That's a very narrow set of goods that's provided by the public sector. The public sector also provides lots of other things like roads, policing, access to water, sewage, all these sorts of things. And the other thing that don't necessarily think about until you grapple with this governance problem is that a lot of these goods are targeted in some way. Okay? So policymakers respond to different interest groups. People have they have different constituencies, voter bases, and things like that. So when they collect up all their tax money, they have to distribute it in a particular way. And oftentimes, it gets distributed in the direction of groups that favor them. And so what we want to see here in this particular set of experiments is different institutions that are designed to constrain policymakers. Okay? They're designed to tie their hands so that they distribute the goods as equally as possible. Okay? That's basically the general picture. So what we're doing is we're constructing a governance game, and we're paying very close attention to policymaker incentives. Okay? And then on top of that governance game, we're going to test a variety of institutions, right, designed to constrain them. So we're going to test voting institutions. Here, it's basically the policymaker can get voted out of office. We're going to test commitment institutions, right, where you force policymakers to deliver on their promises. So you have a very strong record of what policymakers say, and you force them to do it. And then sanctions. So sanctions is just punishing them, right? And the way we're thinking about them is in terms of popular protest, right? We go out on the streets and we protest against policymakers. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is a little odd to do in the lab because you've got like all this real world stuff, but of course the real world stuff doesn't let us isolate, doesn't let us look at behavior at such a fine level as what I'm going to show you today. Okay? So there's a few people, Alvin Roth, who won the Nobel Prize, I think in 2002, has done some work using the lab to design different types of markets. Douglas North has used the lab to study humans and their complex motivational structures, and then of course Lynn Ostrom. Here's some quotes that I can come back to if I have time. Okay. So here's the game setup, and I'm going to go to the visuals because these are lots of details. So essentially, we have 4 people in a group. Okay? They're going to contribute to a good group account. Okay? Now, this group account you can think of as this contribution you can think of as taxes. Okay? So people voluntarily contribute to public goods. This goes into the group account. We randomly take one person in this society, in this world, and make them the policymaker. That's going to matter in just a second. So when people contribute to this group account, now it's got some money. What we do is that we double it, right? So that's economies of scale. So now there's an incentive to contribute to the group account because now there's more money. And then the policymaker alone decides how to distribute the funds. Okay? So the contribution, you can see the parallels with taxation, right? You contribute to the public fund, and then this public fund belongs to the population, but the policymaker is actually in charge of distribution. Now, it's very similar to a typical public goods game that we use to study taxation. Okay? In a typical public goods game, you have 4 citizens. They contribute to a public account. The account doubles, and then it's evenly distributed amongst everybody else. Okay? So that's the usual way that we study taxation in the lab. But of course, this has a very nice rule that everybody understands, right? There's going to be an equal distribution of public funds. What we add is the human element to it, where there's a guy that's in charge of distributing public funds. I'm going to go back to that. Here's some experimental details. We don't have to worry about that. Okay, so that's the basic setup, right? So we're going to do this, the policymaker, we're going to do this over 20 rounds. So it's a long time horizon. We're going to randomly pick one guy from this community. He's going to be the policymaker. He's going to set policy for the next 20 rounds. Now,
may I interrupt?
Yes.
Does the policymaker know how much each contributes to the
yes. So he sees everything.
Okay.
He himself contributes everything, obviously, because he can keep it. So
They can keep everything.
Yeah.
Does not have to distribute it.
yes, exactly. He can do whatever he likes.
And then you get feedback on how he distributed
Yes.
exactly, how to whom he gave the.
No, so they know what they get. They know what they get.
They know
not,
what they get.
Not what other people get.
But do they know how much he kept for himself? No.
So in that sense, it parallels the world in the sense that you understand how much you get out of the public account, but you don't know how much your neighbors get. You don't know what this guy keeps. And then on top of this, so here you can see very easily that if you're a selfish guy, if you're a rational actor, the way we like to call it, this guy should keep everything and give nothing, right? And then people should stop contributing. So that's pretty simple, naive equilibrium. Of course, you can think a little bit further than that and say, okay, well, he should give back some money, just enough to make it profitable for these guys, so that they keep contributing, right? But he keeps most of the money for himself. And in fact, in the baseline, that's what we find, that he keeps most of the money for himself. Now, what we do is we introduce a series of treatments to discipline him, effectively. And these are inspired by the real world. So the first one is, the first set of treatments is on voting. Okay? The first one is what we call random replacement. You can think of this as faux elections or a sort of bad democracy, where the guy is just randomly replaced by somebody else every 4 rounds. Okay? So every 4 rounds we pick a guy, we just throw him back into the pool and then pick somebody else and so on. And then a better voting society is one where you have retrospective voting. So here the guy, policymaker, continues his role for 4 rounds, and then everybody else in the community votes whether to keep him or to replace him with somebody else. Okay? So that, very simple. That's all we're doing with voting. With punishment, we're doing something slightly different. Now here, we have one policymaker, he retains his role for the entire length of for all 20 rounds. And then we have what we call weakest link punishment, which is that we all have to choose a punishment level and we pay a punishment cost, right? So you can think of this as us coming out and protesting. We all pay a cost to protest. But the lowest effort, the lowest cost, is the one that's chosen to be implemented. Okay, so you have a punishment level where we can all punish, but there's a coordination problem. We have to coordinate on the level. We all have to gather at the same place to protest to make it effective. That's what this punishment looks like. And then this one, of course, has communication. So people can talk beforehand and decide where to gather and so on. And then finally, here's one that I promised you. This is more of a I'm dreaming of a better world kind of thing, where the policymaker, before people contribute or pay taxes, he has to declare exactly what he's going to do with the money. Okay? So he has to tell people exactly what he's going to do, and then they contribute, and then that happens exactly how he said. So he can't lie. Effectively, that's what we're doing. Okay? So we're going to test voting, we're going to test sanctions, and we're going to test commitment. Okay. So I'm going through this very quick. There's more details and things, but I'll skip over some of those details. Here's the big picture result for the voting. Okay. On the left here is the amount of earnings for citizens. Okay. So this is the average amount of earnings under the baseline. Right? This is where there's one policymaker for all 20 rounds. Under random replacement, where we just pick one guy at random and replace them every time. See? So earnings go up a little bit. And then through voting. And here you see a big jump in citizen earnings. So citizens do a lot better under the voting institution. Why is that the case? We'll have to come here to policymaker rents. Okay? So this is the amount of money that the policymaker keeps captured that doesn't belong to him, right? So which is what we call rents. Under the baseline condition, he's keeping a lot of money. He's distributing more under random replacement, and then he's distributing even more or keeping even less under the voting institution.
Are they statistically significant?
Sorry, I don't have error bars. This is different from this. This is also different from this.
Oh.
These two are not different from each other, but this is different.
What's true?
And this is, these two are significantly different from each other, and these two are significantly different from each other. So it certainly has a significant effect. Just randomly replacing the guy has a significant effect on voting, on distribution, sorry, but not on the actual benefits, because of course the benefits get distributed to a wider population. But I'll show you the mechanism behind this in just a second. Let's skip over these slides and show you this. The gray, so this, the y variable, so the y-axis is the percentage of the public funds that the policymaker keeps. So this is the amount of public funds that he's keeping for himself, right? Or embezzling or extracting or however you want to think about it. Under random replacement, which is every 4 rounds, the guy is going to get replaced. This is what's happening, right? Here's the replacement part. Here's a new policymaker. He's behaving, starts to steal. He gets replaced, behaving, starts to steal. Gets replaced, behaving, look, starts to really steal, and then towards the end, really goes off with it. Yeah? Okay, but when you look at the voting institution, there's a chance that I will stay in office if I behave. Okay? And so that's what you see. In the beginning, there's not a lot of difference. They're all sort of not significantly different from each other. But by the second round of voting, you see that the policymakers are behaving themselves a lot more in the hopes of getting re-elected. Again, they behave themselves a lot more in the hopes of getting re-elected. Again, behave themselves a lot more. But then look, at the end of the game, which is the last round, which they know that they're not going to get replaced anymore, they just go steal, make a run for it.
Did you think of randomly ending the round?
Yeah, we thought about that. We haven't done that yet. That's the first thing that
will change the pattern of the last round.
Absolutely. But I think this drives home the point that this isn't about people being sort of nicer in this treatment. They're just as bad. Right? It's actually that
they are bad.
The institution is the thing that's keeping them in check. And that makes this case.
Just a question, was this done in one country or several countries?
No, so this is only in Spain. Right now.
I'm just wondering with cultural differences.
That's a great question.
Change the results.
We can replicate here in the AUC and then
we can absolutely
see the difference, yeah?
Absolutely replicate it here. I mean, this is, of course, I understand. It's a Western, country and so on, and it's got everything that comes with it. We can definitely do that. We just haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
I will say that not this, but some of the other treatments have been replicated in Colombia, and they look similar. I'll discuss that in a second. But not voting. They haven't done that in Colombia. Okay, all right. So now that's voting. Now, for voting, we find that that's actually pretty strong evidence that it's pretty effective, right? Better. So having a good quality election is kind of nice in disciplining bad behavior. Right? Now, the next thing we want to focus on is a typical thing in lab experiments, which is on punishment. Here, we implemented punishment. And as I mentioned to you, at the end of every round, people observed and saw what they got, and then they had to decide on a punishment level. In the weakest link punishment, it's essentially the lowest amount of punishment gets implemented across. So the person that generates the least amount of effort, that's the punishment level we're going to. So we have to coordinate, right? But in communication, we can talk about it. And so what happens is, let's look at distributions first. Under weakest link, when we can't talk amongst each other, right? When we don't have that voice, we don't see a whole lot of differences in the amounts of rents captured. So the policymakers are behaving just as badly. This is not significant. But when we can talk and punish, this goes right down to zero, which is pretty remarkable. This is, by the way, before punishment, because punishment hurts and takes money away from the person. This is before that money has been subtracted. So the policymakers are really behaving themselves. For contribution or for actual earnings of citizens, you see that there's a slight reduction in their surplus under weakest link when they can communicate, but when they communicate, this goes up. And this is significantly different from this. So there is certainly an effect on policymaker behavior because of sanctions, right? And there's some effect. This is a weak effect. This is not highly significant, but there is some effect on citizen earnings. And I'm going to skip over this in a second and just show you. This is the level of punishment. Expenditure on punishment with communication, and this is the expenditure on punishment without communication. And so you can see that it's much, much lower. So communication is incredibly important to get punishment to stick. That's the bottom line. So punishment's effective, but only if you can effectively. Finally, we come to the commitment aspect, where we're forcing the policymaker to follow through on their promises. 1 minute, great. And here again, you see policymaker rents dramatically reduced. Right? So they're keeping far less because they're being much more egalitarian because they want contributions to increase. Right? And if you have certainly high level of citizen surplus, significantly different. That comes in. Yeah, I have 1 minute. Let's see. And that also has an effect, just to say, on contributions as well. So people actually, if you make people, policymakers follow through on their promises, people are actually paying more voluntary levels of tax as well, right? Because it's about trust in institutions, as we talked about this earlier. Okay, sorry, so I have... yes, this one?
So you are talking about citizen contributions here, and they are lower.
Oh, sorry. I got this opposite. Yeah. No, it's the opposite. Sorry, that's right. That's the opposite. And let me think back to why it was. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. So they're distributing more. This is true, and the citizens are earning more. This is true. But the reason actually is that you're bringing in the free riding problem. This is the free riding problem. I want to be clear. Okay, so just in terms of doing a quick horse race of these policy mechanisms, for voting, we find that the policy is actually very effective, right? Particularly when you have good voting institutions. Not effective for the bad voting institutions, so it's not just about democracy for the sake of democracy, it's actually having an effective democracy. Punishment, the sanctions are effective, but only when communication is available. So when people can talk to each other and coordinate on mechanisms, that's when it happens, right? So it needs that communication aspect. But punishment by itself is not very effective. It needs that communication aspect. And then finally, for commitment, what we do see is that it does reduce policymaker rent seeking, but actually it also reduces voluntary contribution. So it's got a mixed level. In some sense, commitment is good because it reduces the policymakers' rent-seeking behavior. But in some sense, it's also bad because it also increases the free riding problem for ordinary citizens. So it depends on what it's trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, and this is the results that we talk about in the World Development Report as well, is that certainly when we're comparing things like voting versus punishment, voting tends to perform far better.
What do you mean by free riding?
Free riding is just that that I would like to contribute to taxes, for example, but I would like you to contribute more than me. Right? So I can benefit more if you contribute as much as you want, but I contribute nothing. Right? So that's the free ride. I free ride on your.
It gives advantages to lobbying groups.
Indeed, yes. Great, thank you. Sorry. Yes.
What would be really interesting, so that we will go to the computer stuff. The previous one. Yeah. If we can see a figure showing a comparison between among voting, punishment, and commitment.
Yeah.
Because you showed us each of those compared to the baseline.
Yes.
But how different they are from each other. What do you think? The voting, are they all just comparable to each other, or which is better?
No, that's right. That's a great point. We haven't actually done that yet because there's lots of differences in each of these institutions, right? There's random placement and so on. At the end of the day, it's the voting institution that seems to be the most effective across the board. But I'll take that on board and we'll I mean, we're essentially writing this up as 3 different papers, so that's also a problem. Yeah. So, but anyway, that's a good point. Certainly, when we compare voting to punishment, voting is far outperforms it far more. Commitment is
because your objective is just for policy making, and then we will end up with the concluding question. Okay, which institution shall we adopt? Shall we adopt? The commitment, the punishment, the voting.
Well, ideally you want all of them, but yes, that's right. But yes, in a horse race like that, you're right. Something like that would be very effective. I don't have that here for you, unfortunately.
Very small.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sheheryar, because if this design was applied, it will differ actually for, we have a lot of corruption here.
Yes, indeed.
In our country. Now we will have Amany's presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Amany Bisht. I'll be presenting the implications of country education and community. This was part of my work as a research assistant with Dr. Hamid Shamma. He's a marketing professor in the Department of Management. So reputation is a measure of how people perceive someone or something based on the evaluation of certain dimensions, and accordingly this perception shapes the way people interact back. So applying this to an entity, whether it's a corporate or a nation, we can say that reputation shapes the way that different stakeholders interact back with the entity, whether it's a corporate or a nation. According to the Reputation Institute, country reputation has an impact on attracting tourism and investments, increasing exports, improving public diplomacy, attracting knowledge and talent, and attracting the support of different stakeholders. So academics and practitioners are becoming more and more concerned with the reputation concept, and reputation management is no longer restricted to corporates as before. Now nations are more concerned with managing their reputation relative to each other to build a positive reputation and to minimize the risks and to build a good competitive position. This is a popular quote for Warren Buffett. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you take that into consideration, you will do things differently. So apparently, having a good reputation for a long time doesn't guarantee maintaining this reputation for good. For example, if you take it on a country scope, when a country is subject to a terrorist attack, this makes it perceived as an unsafe place, and accordingly, it affects there's a drop in tourism in this country. Yes, it has been noticed that when a crisis takes place on a highly reputable country, it takes less effort and less time to recover from this impact if compared to the impact on a lower reputable country. we can say that there is a mutual relation between the reputation of countries and companies. The reputation of a country contributes to the companies originating in it, and of course it promotes the products of the country. And it goes the other way around. The reputation of a company contributes to building the reputation of a country. We can apply the same concept on communities, that the reputation of communities, the reputation of a country, contributes to different communities inside the country. We're talking about schools, universities, companies, and the local communities, and so on. There have been several methodologies to measure country reputation. Each methodology depends on evaluating certain dimensions that are seen to affect country reputation. The most recent, the widely used one is the red track model. This one was developed by the Reputation Institute. It measures country reputation based on the emotional perceptions of people towards three dimensions: the advanced economy, effective government, and appealing environment. This model also measures the behavioral intentions of people towards the country. So for the advanced economy, it measures the extent of agreement of people towards the country being producing high-quality products and services, having many well-known brands, contributing to global culture, being technologically advanced, well-educated workforce, and valuing education. For the appealing environment dimension, it measures how beautiful the country is perceived and if it's an enjoyable country, if it offers an appealing lifestyle, and how much people are friendly and welcoming. For the effective government, it has sub-dimensions to measure how effective the government is. And accordingly, it measures the behavioral intentions of people towards the country in terms of their willingness to visit, live, work, study, invest, and buy from the country. So in my paper, in my research, I adopted the red track model for its similarity with the purpose of the paper, which is to measure the perception of people towards country and link it to their behavioral intention towards the country in terms of the visit, live, and study, and what we have just mentioned. So a quantitative online survey was launched to measure the reputation of 20 countries. The total responses we got was 733 responses. And we only took the responses for people who were familiar with the country that we are questioning. People who had below average familiarity with the country, the responses were excluded. So after taking the responses, we started quantitating the responses. We started quantitating the responses by giving scores to each of the agreements, the extent of agreement with each statement that I showed. And we found that the appealing environment dimension has from 32 to 38% from the total score of the reputation of the country. For the effective government, it counted for 30 to 34% from the total score for the reputation of the country, and the advanced economy from 31 to 35% of the total score. The part related to community, we are relating the three dimensions to the behavioral intentions towards the country. So we found a high correlation between the three dimensions of we've mentioned and the willingness to visit, live, work, invest, and buy from and study from the country. You can notice here the effective government has the highest correlation for most of the behavioral intentions, except for the buy from intention. We find that the advanced economy has the highest impact on the behavioral intention of buying from the country. You also notice that the appealing environment has a high impact on the willingness to visit the country, which could be realistic. We found also from the different statements that we mentioned for all the dimensions that being beautiful, being safe, contributing to the global culture, favorable environment for doing business, and valuing education, these are the highest statements that contributed to building the positive perception of reputation for the country. So finally, we can say that country reputation affects the behavioral intentions of people towards the country in terms of willingness to visit, live, work, study, and invest in the country. And these behavioral intentions accordingly affect the community related to it. So if people are coming to study in the country, so it definitely affects the community of universities and schools. If they are coming to work here, work in the country, this affects the community of companies. If they are just visiting, it affects the local community, and so on. So there's a mutual relation between the country reputation and the community. And accordingly, building a good country reputation reflects on the community. I would just want to highlight a small thing regarding the impact of any crisis on a country as the terrorist attacks that occurs in any country. We can relate it to a realistic incident, the attacks that happen in Paris and the US versus similar attacks that happen in Egypt and Turkey. In US and Paris have a higher reputation, so the impact of these attacks or this crisis were not comparable to taking place in Egypt and Cairo. It had less impact, and this was shown in the Reputation Institute annual reports, that there has been a drop in reputation points for these countries, yet the influence on or the impact on attracting tourism was much worse in the case of Turkey and Egypt, and this was related to having a lower reputation than Paris and Turkey. Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Amany, for your presentation. Really related to mine a little bit. It's because I'm talking about a case that affects the reputation of people. It's really the sequence. Hello. I hope that you are not sleepy. Okay. I would like to ask if someone knows about the case 173 for 2011. It's famous in the media by foreign fund for non-profit organization case. Anyone know about this case? The court, actually? Please. Okay. So I'm going to explain what happened in this court and this case, and go further in details about the opinion of some non-profit organization about this case. In 2011, around 43 workers in non-profit organizations, especially human rights advocacy centers, were accused for doing some bad activities, or as mentioned in the media, that they giving bad reputation about Egypt worldwide. So they are sentenced to imprison for 3 years, and some of them are foreigners. So the case was very famous for that, and the Minister of Social Solidarity, she came in the media, Dr. Badawi, and said that most of organizations that are not registered as a Ministry of Social Solidarity have to go to the ministry and register and to have a legal framework, rather than having a legal framework under the Ministry of Investment. And this was my passion toward the study itself, because I feel that why some organizations are registrating under the Ministry of Investment, not the Ministry of Social Solidarity, while the law itself is under the Ministry of Social Solidarity. So the reason for my study was the case for 173, which is famous by foreign fund case. And I would like to explore the law itself. It's called Law number 84 of 2002 for association and foundation. The law is mainly done for non-profit organization, but there is a conflict with the non-profit organization and the policymaker since this law has been issued. So I would like to go further in details and know more about the law and the opinion of the organizations for that law. my general question was how should government regulate civil society organizations in Egypt without restricting their right to work free? So mainly the questions of my research was around the law and the opinion of this organization around the law and what they suggest for a new law, because recently there is motivation for some organizations to write a new law that regulate the legal framework. And also I asked my interviewers about if they participate in the new law or not. Actually, the meaning of the non-profit organization is mainly these organizations are community-based organizations that and the institution and network that people collect together with the same common interest, that they are willing to go to do good for the others and participated in the political sphere and social sphere as well, and contributed to their community they want to give back to their community.
So, Dina, you just have 5 minutes,
okay,
because the main speech will start.
Okay. So mainly the organization in Egypt are working in giving services for the people, because there is a gap between the services that the government provide and the market. So these non-profit organizations are filling this gap. They promote the awareness about human rights, offer legal assessment for protesters, especially after the revolution in 2011, and promote social justice. My conceptual framework was mainly around the law, and if this law is a participatory one or not, and if the advocacy centers participate in designing this law. And I was actually reviewing some articles of the law, which is mainly making the conflict according to what's said in the media at that time. And I will go a bit deep in these 4 articles. And the media propaganda about taking the foreign fund for this organization. And recently, around 500 organizations are accused, and the members of this organization are banned from traveling and confiscate their assets. Okay, the law, actually, the 4 articles in the law related to the registration of this organization. Every organization should have an office, and this office has a certain design or structure that should be followed by regarding to the law. Every organization go to the ministry with filling application with their name and mission and vision and activities that they are going to do within this organization. Actually, there is a statement in this article. For me, it's a very vague terminology, because it says that this organization can do any activity that is distributing the national security, which is not identified clearly for this organization. And another thing, that this organization can do anything that affect or against public order, which is not also identified in the law. The other article is related to the internal operation within this organization, that the government have the right to send a supervisor to attend any meeting within this organization, and this meeting, the minutes of this meeting have to be sent to the ministry within 30 days after the meeting, and if the organization didn't do this general meeting for successive 2 years, this organization will be dissolved. And if someone in the board of the meeting has any political affiliation, this organization could be dissolved also. And if there will be election inside the organization, the list of nominees in this election has to be sent to the ministry first. So if there's someone has any political affiliation or has a bad reputation, or he has been detained for a month or for a day, this person could be dismissed from this election or this list. And there is some articles regarding foreign fund that the organization has to have approval before taking any foreign fund. This approval is sent to the ministry before they take the money. 60 days before they take the money, actually. And if sometimes the ministry didn't reply if they accept or reject this fund, and any organization can't use this fund if they didn't take this approval, and the owner or the founder of this organization could be sentenced to 6 months imprisonment or pay around 2,000 Egyptian pounds if they used this fund without applying for it or didn't wait for the acceptance of this fund by the ministry. And the fourth one is the penalties. Actually, the penalties is under the different laws in Egypt because there is different rules regarding the penalties. So the non-profit organization penalties is under 3 laws. This law, law 84, and the Egyptian Penal Code and Civil Code. And recently there is an announcement by President Sisi that if anyone receives foreign fund will be harmed, that harm the national unity and the reputation of Egypt. Actually, this person will be sentenced to a life imprisonment or pay a fine of 500,000 Egyptian pounds. This is mainly my literature review or what I reviewed before doing my research. And actually, the main thing that I get from my research that most of the people they know that there is a lot of weaknesses inside the law that prevent this organization from accomplishing their mission and do work effectively and do good governance inside this organization and be accountable for their donors, at least. The methodology, actually, I did a qualitative research method because I want to hear and go in depth with the people that I interviewed from this organization. I reviewed the articles of the law and did a participant observation in the report for 2 organizations in the case. One is called the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, and the other is Nazra for Feminist Studies. And then I did the snowballing and did in-depth interviews with 7 organizations. One of them is already resolved, and I did the interview with the lawyer of the case. The result was that the law is full of loopholes, but the problem is with the application of the law itself, not the content of the law. The people working in the Ministry of Social Security, they didn't understand the law, so they applied it. They applied some rules that they feel that they keep the reputation of Egypt good, but they don't know that if it is under the law or not. Actually, I did a thematic analysis for what I get, the results, and I will go in details in some of them. That the law affect the freedom of operation inside the organization, like what I said that they have to send the minutes of the meeting, and that there is some paperwork terminologies inside the law that the organization themselves don't know the meaning of this law or these terminologies, and sometimes from time to time that there is a bill for orders come to the organization and they don't know that the need of if this orders is legal or not. Sometimes it's come up a new order that they have to submit new papers or something like that. And actually, regarding to the advocacy centers and human rights centers, they are registering under the Ministry of Investment as a civil firm because the registration in the Ministry of Investment is easier and there is no such bureaucracy like in Ministry of Social Security. There is a suppression from the state. Actually, that Some organizations are dissolved because of their political affiliation, as what I mentioned before, and some organizations said that they have organized some events in hotels, and these hotels suddenly canceled the events because they told them that it's affecting the security issues in Egypt, so we will cancel these events. And some organization is dissolved, like what happened in the Redistribution for street children, and the two founders, they are in a case now, and they have been in prison for 3 years. Sustainability of organization. Actually, in Egypt, we have a problem regarding to the funding of this organization, because most of Egyptians are donating for charities, but they don't donate for any organization working in development or education or art, music. They say this is a conceptual or a culture motivation for Egyptian people, like what they do in Ramadan, and they donate for organizations working in charity, but they will not give their money for organizations working on development, because actually the word development is recently come up in Egypt, so they don't know what is development. And this is also a misunderstanding in the law, because people don't know what is the meaning of building capacity. If an organization is doing activity like building capacity, so the people in the ministry said that what is building capacity? So they have to write in because building capacity is a little bit related to political issues. So they think that you are going to make some people that go to the street and demonstrate, and okay, so we will have again another revolution. So they have to write the word that they are doing computer training, leadership training, and presentation skills, so they can give us this headache from the ministry, and avoid that these activities will be cancelled because of the word building capacity, and also the word campaign, because it's also linked with the politics in Egypt. And there is a lot of bureaucracy inside the organization. One of the organization said that the owner of the organization said that we took around 1.5 years to register, because they didn't understand what is the feminist studies. Are you going to give ladies money, or are you going to what is studied regarding to feminism? And someone said that you have to be patient to deal with all these procedures inside the ministry and the production, of course. You have to pay a bribe to get your work done quickly. And the law is not participatory. Actually, the recent one is not participatory as well. In 2013, there is a law that written by some organization, and two of my research organizations were participating in this law, but suddenly this law disappeared because this minister actually left his position. And another law came by Dr. Ghadawi, but suddenly this law also didn't go to the parliament, because the parliament in the committee published another law. So finally, I concluded that the problem is not with the law itself, the problem is the application of the law, actually. Because people in the ministry didn't understand the law, and that made them apply another, I don't know if it is another thing or not, but they apply some orders that come to them from time to time, and if an organization is prevented to do their activity, they said that this is a national security order that comes to us, and we can't say no to the state security orders. Actually, I have a limitation in this study because of the time, and actually because it's a critical and sensitive issue. And most of the organizations, they closed their offices because of the case. So I only have 7 organizations, so I can generalize my data for the whole organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well done. Thank you so much. Now the last speaker.